I want to talk this morning about the Christian's mindset. We all have a mindset. Some of us don't realize we have a mindset. You know, when you get married, you begin to realize the differences of mindsets. Have you ever realized that, those of you that are married? Yes. You thought that your mindset was the norm, and then you get married and you find out that maybe it wasn't the norm. And so that's what we call adjustments. But for the Christian, there is a mindset. It's not that every one of us do the same type of thing, because God has gifted us in various ways so that we can fill certain things that He wants us to fill and do in our sphere of influence. In other words, He wants us to be like Jesus where we are, but He has given us abilities. We have different personalities. We have different gifts. I enjoy the gift of singing that some people have. I listen to Gaither music and enjoy hearing some of those who can swell with the enthusiasm and the beauty of the words of songs. Like I mentioned last week, Margaret and I had listened, even last week I brought my cell phone to her so she could hear it again, where Larnell Harris and Sandy Patty sang, "I've Just Seen Jesus." And then I found another couple singing it, and I played it for her, and we just relished. And our spirits, our souls were lifted up in praise and honor to the Lord as we listened to that music. Now, I grew up in a musical family, so music really ministers to my inner being. And when my granddaughter, River, was born, my daughter we played music, classical music. We heard that Mozart playing that will help the child increase their intelligence. So I had a little player and played Mozart while she was lying there, while she was pregnant. And so River has loved music. Music has been her soul song, her way of soul expression. And so the other day, I think I mentioned this to you when we were at the Hoosier Christian Village, and my daughter and River came to visit, and Margaret was kind of there back in a chair. Well, River had compassion on her and took a little blanket and pulled the blanket up and wrapped it around her and started singing to her and patting her. And I thought, what a delightful thing to see that, the compassion, how music speaks to her. Well, music speaks to so many of us, and we have a Christian mindset that is to use the gifts that God has given us. And in Mark chapter 9, verses 30 through 37, we may recognize this as being somewhat familiar. We have read it. Maybe you have heard many sermons on it. Mark 9, verses 30 through 37. This is an event that took place before the death and crucifixion and death of Jesus and His resurrection. And it says, "They went on from there and passed through Galilee. And He did not want anyone to know, for He was teaching His disciples, saying to them, 'The Son of Man is going to be delivered into the hands of men, and they will kill Him. And when He is killed, after 3 days He will rise.'" So they were told all of this ahead of time. But you know, so often when God speaks to us in His Word and He teaches us things, sometimes we don't remember them in the time of crisis or when we need to remember them. But they did not understand the saying and were afraid to ask Him. And they came to Capernaum, and when He was in the house, He asked them, "What were you discussing on the way?" But they kept silent. Guilt. For on the way they had argued with one another who was the greatest. And He sat down and called the 12. And He said to them, "If anyone would be first, he must be last of all and servant of all." And He took a child and put him in the midst of them, And taking him in his arms, he said to them, "Whoever receives one such child in my name receives me. And whoever receives me receives not me, but him who sent me." Now, somehow I think that many of us could identify with these disciples, all saying who was the greatest, who would be the greatest, who would be number one. Do you ever have those arguments in your family, among your siblings? I don't see people having a guilty look, but I think you must have, because that's kind of a thing that we do. I remember when I was 5 years old, I was having this discussion with a girl from church. She was a year older than me, and she lived downstairs. We were in what in Chicago we called a two-flat back in the early days. And she went to our church, same church as I did, so we knew each other. And Margie was her name. For the years, I wouldn't call my wife Margie because I had this bad experience with this Margie. So that's why only lately have I started calling her Margie. But anyhow, this Margie was a very argumentative little girl. And I don't know how it happened, but somehow we got onto this thing of whose dad was the best. And she argued and had her points. I argued and had my points. And believe it or not, I won the verbal argument, but she hauled off and scratched my face. And I still have a scar where her one nail went super deep. And you can see why I didn't call Margaret Margie for a number of years. Though I won the verbal argument, I lost that physical aspect of the argument. But I did learn never to argue with a lady. But here is this wonderful story, and it speaks to us. I'm reminded of the story of a group of friends who went out deer hunting. And they decided that they would go in pairs because this was not a familiar territory, a familiar area, the woods. And so they went off in pairs. And finally, all the other guys got back except for one group of two. And then when they heard a lot of noise and this coming around the corner, they saw this man carrying an 8-point buck and struggling to bring that buck in. And the other guy said, "Well, where's Harry?" He said, "Well, Harry fainted up the trail a ways." They said, "Well, how come you didn't carry Harry?" He said, "Well, that was a tough call, but I figured nobody would steal Harry, but they might steal my buck." Those of you that have hunted probably can recognize with that. Well, to this deer hunter, he had a mindset. He had a priority, a group of priorities that he was following, and that's why he did it that way. In contrast, some of you that are into football may remember this if you're old enough, that in the 80s and 90s there was a football player famous for the Detroit Lions. Now, when I was in Michigan, everybody watched the Detroit Lions. And he was also a member of the Buffalo Bills for a time, Chris Spielman. You ever hear of Chris Spielman? Okay. Chris Spielman was a really wonderful football linebacker. He did a great job. He was well received. But in 1994, when Chris's wife was diagnosed with cancer, Chris quit football. And he made it his goal and his project to take care of his wife. He moved into his wife's hospital room. He waited on her hand and foot. He only ate what she ate, and when her hair came out during chemotherapy, he shaved his head. He became the primary caretaker for their 2 children. Today, Stephanie is in remission and feeling good, and Chris has no regrets about giving up his football career for his wife and family. Jesus and his disciples had just arrived at Capernaum, and when they were settled in, Jesus asked them, "What were you discussing?" And it became suddenly quiet. What seemed to the disciples to be of such great importance when they were walking on the road and talking amongst themselves, now, when Jesus raised the question, to lay this before Jesus seemed almost inappropriate. But they had to confess. They had to confess that this argument that seemed so powerful and so great and so important to them on the way, now in the very presence of Jesus, no longer seemed very important. In fact, their hearts struck them. The guilt came down on them as they realized it was sinful, petty pride. No wonder they were embarrassed. They didn't want to tell Jesus what they had been arguing about. Well, Chris Spielman probably thought at one time in his life that winning football was the most important thing, but his priorities changed when someone he loved was threatened by life-threatening disease. You know, Jesus called the 12 and said to them, if anyone would be first, he must be last of all and servant of all. And taking a child, he set that child before them and then put the child in his arms. That must have been something. I suspect that the mother of that child was just really thrilled. And Jesus said, whoever receives one such child in my name receives me, and whoever receives me receives not me, but him who sent me. If you're like many people in our society, in our culture, especially our American culture, we all have desired to be successful in our career, whatever our career is. We all want it to be best. I remember when I was going to Bible school, training for the ministry, later on went on to other colleges. But I met with two other guys. We were called the Three Musketeers. They were all studying for the ministry. All three of us went into the ministry. And all three of us stayed in the ministry. In fact, my one buddy that was best man at my wedding is still a evangelist in Church of the Nazarene and lives in Ohio. He's still going active. The third fellow just recently retired. He was a Wesleyan pastor in Michigan, just recently retired. So all three of us continued on. We didn't try to compete, but we did put together sermons and kind of contrasted sermons with each other. And so that has always been an encouragement as we have tried to keep in touch somewhat with each other. But we all want to succeed in what we do. We don't want to do a half-hearted job, do we? I think that many of you, especially you fellows that are farmers and so forth, you learn from your dad and your grandpa, your uncles and others, and they all had pretty strict rules of what you should do and what you shouldn't do and how to best plant. And that's true in so many other areas of our lives. There are ways in which we can do our job best. And if we want to succeed, we want to do the best that we can. It's like a young woman from New York who dreamed of being a movie star. She moved to California, to Hollywood, studied acting, pounded the pavement looking for jobs. She said, though she did not really come from Montana, she said she came fresh off the ranch of Montana. She thought that would be a good selling point in Hollywood. This farm girl turned starlet angle might work for her. She was pretty but not glamorous. She could sing but not real well. She was energetic and funny, but female comedians were not popular in those days. One of her colleagues even advised her, go back to Montana and be a happy cowgirl. But that's not what she wanted to do. She decided that her happiness lay there in Hollywood. Eventually, she made a name for herself. She became known as the funniest woman in television. She went on to become one of the most powerful people in television, even having her own studio. Her name, Lucille Ball. I Love Lucy. She had a hard time, but she became something because she had priorities. She had a mindset. There's nothing wrong with wanting to be successful, but we must have the right reasons. Personal ambition, I believe, is a gift from God. If we did not have it, we would not achieve much at all. We would not struggle to do a good job. It's bestowed upon us by God so that we can achieve our best. God has given us our abilities and talents, and He wants us to do our best and be our best. After all, when you go to the doctor, you want to go to the best doctor there is. When I changed doctors, I went on the website and I checked it out. His education and all the other things, the reviews, how many dots or stars or whatever there were, because you want to go to a doctor that knows his business. You don't want to go to a shade tree mechanic type of doctor, do you? And when you go to a restaurant, you want to be sure that the cook just didn't get there because there were no other jobs available. You want to be sure that the cook really knows what he or she is doing and is a great cook. When you need a car repair or a truck repair, you want to go to a mechanic, to someone that knows what he's doing and have the best job. Somebody said, intelligence without ambition is a bird without wings. Striving to be the best can be healthy as long as we are able to put it into perspective. Winning isn't everything, neither is it the only thing, but we have to be careful because being number one can cost us our soul. Look at Solomon. Solomon was gifted by God tremendously with intelligence, with wealth, honor, prestige, with military success, all of those things. But toward the end, he did not follow the advice of the prophets, and he married all these foreign women who served false gods and built false temples for them. And he then, in his old age, was led astray by these women, according to the scriptures. So we have to be so careful. There are those who have sold their souls for the gain, the fame, whatever it may be that's around us and in our world. And so we have to be careful because God, the Lord Jesus, wanted his disciples to have a mindset that was not selfish but selfless. He wanted them to follow him and do the best that they could. Some anonymous writer has put in a beautiful illustration that I'd like to give, and I think you can see the value of this. This writer said, imagine life as a game where you are juggling 5 balls. Have you ever tried to juggle? When I was growing up on TV in black and white, they would have jugglers. And I don't know how many times I tried, but I'm not very coordinated. I never could keep more than 2 balls in the air at the time. But anyhow, let's imagine that life is a juggling thing, and you have 5 balls that you are trying to keep in the air. Work, family, health, friends, and faith. You're trying to keep them all going in the air, and you soon learn that work is a rubber ball. If you drop it, it will bounce back. But all the others are glass balls. If you drop them, they may shatter or they may have some kind of breakage to them. And this is a powerful picture, I believe, because work is like a rubber ball. But the most important things in life, family, health, friends, and faith, are made of glass. And if you neglect these, you will not be a success. A few years ago, Tom Block resigned as the chief executive officer of H&R Block. I don't know if you heard this story. The company at that time was a $1.7 billion tax preparation and financial services firm founded by Tom's father. But Tom left this prestigious job to become a teacher at an inner city parochial school in Kansas City, Missouri. His salary was $15,000 a year, 3% of what he had been making. Those that were questioning asked why. But Block knew that the hectic schedule as CEO had been interfering with his top priorities, that of his wife and his children, and he also felt a very strong need to give to others and not just be taking. And so Block said that the hardest thing was telling his dad, Henry Block, who co-founded the company in 1955. But he said, I didn't want to look back on my life and say, wow, you had an opportunity to play a bigger role in your children's lives and did not take it. Tom Block knew which ball was made of rubber and which one was made of glass. And then there was an article in Reader's Digest about a young woman named Elsa. Elsa no longer remembers the argument that started that morning before breakfast, but she and her husband got in an argument. And then he got dressed and got ready to go out to work. And she cried. She was crying. And she said, how can you go off like that? We haven't settled a thing. And she said her husband, Tom, turned around, went to the phone, canceled all his appointments that day, and stayed home that day to settle the argument with her and show her that she was his chief priority. Now, some people have priorities and they are straight. They know their priorities. Then there's a story that James Moore, a pastor, tells of a church man who was a member of the church, and he came to his pastor one day to the pastor's study. He was number one in his business. His voice began to quiver as he talked to the pastor. He said, I've just come from the doctor's office. The doctor told me I have only 6 months to live. And he said, as I walked out of the doctor's office, I realized I have wealth, I have everything. I can borrow money on my name, high amounts of money on my name only. But he said, I realize I have no spiritual resources from which to cope with these experiences and this knowledge that I will only have 6 months to live. He said, I'm poor in the things that count the most, and I realize that now. I put my faith in the wrong things. And the truth is, I'm destitute, spiritually destitute. Do you understand? I can borrow money on my name only. But he leaned forward and crying softly, he said, but I have realized there are some things I can't buy or borrow. There are some things you can't buy or borrow. Family, friends, and health and faith. These are the glass balls. And so Jesus put a child in front of the disciples. Children often remind us that our priorities are out of whack. Have you ever noticed that? In People magazine a few years ago, there was a story about a man who was able to regain his focus because of a child, his little daughter, Megan. When she was born, came about 18 months of age, they learned that she had failing kidneys and would need a new kidney. As they went to the doctor tested both of them, and both mom and dad could donate a kidney. They were donors. But the mom's family had kidney disease on their side of the family and also high blood pressure, so the doctor did not want to use her kidney. But Randy, the father, he would match, and he could do it. But the only thing was, he weighed 300 pounds. And the doctors were afraid that his body wouldn't take the change, having that kidney surgery and all the other things. And so Randy, knowing that he needed to do something in order to save his daughter's life, he went on a diet. And his friends at work all helped him. He exercised, low-fat diet, and did all the things the doctor told him to do. And his friends at work would give clothes as he was losing weight and needed other clothes. They would give clothes to him. And finally, he lost 100 pounds, went down to 194 pounds, and was able to have the surgery. And his kidney was put into his child. And the surgery went well. And according to the story, that they are both now doing well. Because of his love for his daughter, Randy learned that what his priorities were. And in prioritizing his daughter, he learned that the amazing truth of how love for our children can help us regain our focus in life. And so all of those stories and all of that brings me to this point. What are your priorities in life? What about your love for the Lord? I've talked about individuals that have done things for love and got their priorities straight because of that. What about our love for the Lord? What are our priorities? We're under a lot of pressure, and there's so many things going on in our world, and we need to be sure that our priorities are right with the Lord and that we are ready to follow and do whatever the Lord wants us to do, and that we don't drop that glass ball of faith and lose what is most important. Let's bow our heads together. Our Father, I thank you that Jesus' story and this account points us to the fact of how important it is to have our priorities straight. And I pray that you will help each of us to consider our love for you and consider what you may ask us to do in rearranging our priorities, in being available, in doing whatever you want us to do. And I pray that you will help us accomplish that through the name of Jesus. Amen.